In a world that can be challenging and at times unpredictable, it's hard to find moments to focus on what you need. Join Stephanie James on The Spark as she guides you to use your inner flame to ignite your best life. As a best-selling author, psychotherapist, transformational life coach, and international show host, Stephanie is dedicated to helping you create a life that takes you, your goals, and your passions to the next level, so you can live a life that is fully lit up and fully alive. She believes that your life is meant to be a beautiful expression of the things that light you up. That by living your dreams, you give permission to others to do the same. Are you ready to feel alive and inspired to fuel your dreams and put a fire behind your desires? Let's ignite a spark in one another that will illuminate the world. The Spark, with your host Stephanie James, starts now.
Welcome to The Spark. I'm your host, Stephanie James. I hope that you're all doing really, really well. I hope that you're taking good care of yourself, just really making time to just carve out a little bit of space, whether it's mindfulness, whether it's some exercise, sitting down, having a cup of tea. And I hope tonight that you're rested and relaxed and ready for just an amazing guest that's joining me. Author, teacher, incredible speaker, Laura Davis. Laura, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here talking to you today.
Thank you so much. You all will remember Laura was the co-author of Courage to Heal, which was the amazing book that came out in 1988, and it helped millions of women, millions of people dealing with sexual abuse, and really helping people to find their voice. And since then, Laura has had 7 books translated, I believe, in 11 languages, and over 1.8 million copies sold. And these are nonfiction books. And this book that we're going to be talking about tonight is Laura's latest book. I have it right here with me. I hope that there's not a glare on this. The Burning Light of 2 Stars. And this is a mother-daughter story and a memoir. So Laura, and as I shared with you when we have spoken before, this book just touched my heart so much, as I know it will other people. We all have mothers, and we've all had, times of incredible journeys, maybe not the same as yours. Yours has been very unique. Can you talk a little bit about what sparked this book in you?
This book was just, I would say it was just like burning inside of me and had to come out. And it also needed me to wait to write it until I was ready, until I had the perspective, the maturity, the compassion to portray this incredibly volatile relationship between my mother and me. And to portray us both as human, flawed, dramatic characters, who were locked at first into conflict with each other, and then into decades-long journey to reconcile with each other and to make peace. And this story really runs from the time my mother called me at 80 to tell me she was moving to my town until her death. And then that's really the focal point, is what it was like to take care of her. And the question I really needed to ask for myself and for my readers is it possible to caretake a parent who betrayed you in the past? And that's the journey I was on, and what I wanted to tell people.
Yes. Wow. Yes. And, and one of the things I'm remembering, Laura, from the book too, is just the powerful transformation that you went through personally, because it was like after Courage to Heal came out, you were touring around and like a celebrity, and you had your own transformational journey that you've gone through. And I don't know how much is written about it in the book, I guess. And I guess I'm wondering, can you share some of that with our audience? Because it's so significant.
Yeah, the courage to heal grew out of my own awareness. When I was 27 years old, I began to remember that I had been sexually abused by my grandfather, my mother's father, so my maternal grandfather. And it was just incredibly devastating to have this memory start to emerge. And it just threw my life into devastation. And I didn't think I would survive it actually at the time. And I was completely consumed because it made everything in my life both make sense and not make sense. It explained so many things, but it also was like, how could this have happened? And at that time, I went to my mother. She and I already had a pretty volatile and shaky relationship at that point. She was the kind of mother who was like the sun, and she expected me as her daughter to orbit around her. And the problem was she had given birth to another son. And so the two of us were locked in a lot of conflict. And she tended to think that every choice I made in my life was to spite her. It was all about her. So we already were kind of in a difficult place. And when I called to tell her about her father and what had happened, she just completely turned on me. And instead of supporting me, she attacked me. And she chose to go with her dead father over her living daughter. And so that really kind of broke our relationship apart. And at the same time, I teamed up with the writer Ellen Bass, and we wrote the book, The Courage to Heal, which was the first guidebook for survivors of sexual abuse about the healing process. And so, up until that point, there was not that much written about survivors of sexual abuse, but what was written was basically like, this is rare, and if it happens to you, your life is ruined. That was sort of the gist of the message. And so this book, our book, was the first to really tell survivors that you can heal, that you don't have to carry this for the rest of your life, and this is the pathway to how to do it. And it was written in very clear, accessible language with tons of first-person stories, and it just touched a chord, and it just took off like this grassroots bestseller. So in terms of my relationship with my mother, not only was I spreading what she called lies about my grandfather, now I was doing it on national TV because I was suddenly catapulted into being famous for the worst thing that had ever happened to me. So it was a very challenging time. It was a conflicted time. I felt really honored to be able to help women in such a incredibly large way and on such a scale. But I was young and I really didn't know how to handle it. And then the estrangement from my mother and her whole side of the family was just devastating for me. So that's where I was in my early 30s, 31 when the book came out. And there was something, I can't even to this day say what it was, but there was something in my relationship with my mother where both of us, no matter how bitterly estranged we were, I think underneath all of those feelings was this desire to somehow connect with each other again. Like there was some good or some connection that was true that neither one of us was willing to give up on, even though we did not speak for years. And so over the course of the next 20 years, starting with when I had my first child at 36, we really worked on rebuilding our relationship. And we agreed to disagree, about this huge issue of the incest. We ultimately, after I had done many years of healing, and I didn't really need anything from her anymore, got to the point of really setting that aside and starting to rebuild a relationship based on the ways we could connect. And that went pretty well. At the time, I think I would have said that we were reconciled until she turned 80. And that's what I wanted to read to you actually is the first thing that kind of set this whole new trajectory of our relationship into motion.
Yes, I would love it. And I know the listening audience would love it. Laura's going to read an excerpt from the book to kind of set the stage here.
So this is called The Call, Chapter 2. And the only thing you really need to know about this, setting it up, is that I'm living in California with my wife and our two youngest children, who are, I think one was 11 and one was maybe 15 at this point. And I had just gotten over a year of very intense treatment for breast cancer. And immediately before this scene that I'm going to read you, I had gone in the backyard with this binder, this white plastic binder that I had gotten from the Stanford Cancer Center. And it had like all my appointments and all my medication and how to take care of myself and all about chemotherapy. And I took this out in the backyard. We had a fire pit and I burned it. And it was just a private ritual, just me, a match, some kindling, and this notebook. And I really wanted to let go of my life as a cancer patient and my identification with that. And the idea was that now, finally, my treatment was over. I had a good prognosis, and I was going to be able to have some just open, relaxed space where I could integrate what I had just been through, this brush with mortality that I had had. And all I'm thinking about when I'm sitting out there watching these pages burn and is, now I could finally have just a calm life with no toxic surprises. And then this is the scene that follows. 2 hours after my ceremony, I tasted my homemade tomato sauce simmering on the stove, added basil and oregano, a generous pinch of salt, a splash of red wine. Karen was picking up the kids on her way home from Watsonville High School teaching reading. They'd be home in half an hour. I was about to drop a handful of spaghetti into a pot of boiling water when the phone rang. It was my mother in New Jersey. We were due for a call. We hadn't spoken in several weeks. Cradling the phone between my neck and shoulder, I dropped the pasta into the pot, stirred to separate the strands. My glasses fogged with steam. I imagined her smoking parliaments, curled up with an Afghan on the couch in the den. She'd probably just gotten home from her poetry class, or her Shakespeare class, or her Course in Miracles study group. I could never track her schedule. I set the timer for 13 minutes. Lori, I've got a surprise for you. Oh, yeah? I was only half listening, maybe a quarter. I opened the fridge, rooted around for salad fixings. Why don't you guess? I don't know, Mom. What's the surprise? Don't you want to guess? I heard her lighting another cigarette, residue of the day's lipstick reddening the tip. You went to an audition and got a part in a play? No, I'm afraid my acting days are over. Guess again. Just tell me, Mom. Are you sure you want to know? Yes, of course, I want to know. Darling, I've finally made up my mind. She paused for effect. I'm moving to Santa Cruz. I wanted you to be the first to know. Blood rushed from my head. I closed the refrigerator, leaned back against the door. Pictures of the kids and little square art magnets clattered to the floor. It's true. Years earlier, in a moment of generosity, I had invited Mom to move out to California when she got old. We'd talked about it once or twice, but I had never thought she'd actually taken me up on it. It had been 10 years. It finally feels like the right time, Lori. New Jersey just isn't the same anymore. That's right. Your friends are dying off, going into assisted living, or moving to be close to their children. Oh my God, that's me. My hand tightened on the phone. My mother and I had been estranged for years. Yes, we'd forged a shaky peace, but 3,000 miles still separated us for a reason. Our reconciliation only went so far. I just love Santa Cruz, and I love your family. Wow, Mom, that's amazing. I mean, great. I'm so happy. Well, that's good, darling, because I met with a real estate agent today and I've put my condo on the market. She says it's the perfect time to sell a place at the shore. I collapsed into one of the red, cushy chairs at our yellow Formica kitchen table and stared at the black and white linoleum. The floor needed a washing. Lori, are you there? Yeah, Mom, I'm here. You still want me, don't you? Of course, I want you. We all want you. It's just that I thought you'd never do it. Well, I'm not getting any younger. No, she wasn't. Mom was 80 years old and her memory was failing. You don't sound very excited. I am excited. I'm just surprised, that's all. How could I possibly be excited? The woman who'd betrayed me at the worst moment of my life was moving to my town, and I was the one who'd invited her. A beep reverberated in my head and wouldn't stop. Mom was talking about escrow and how hard it was going to be to pack, but I barely heard her. She was the white noise in the background. I was hovering outside my body, listening to just one voice, the one screaming in my head, taking up every inch of bandwidth. I'd finally gotten through cancer, and now this? Why the hell didn't you ask me? How about, Lori, do you remember that conversation we had 10 years ago? I've been thinking about it more seriously, and I wonder if you still think it would be a good idea. For you, for me, for us, for Karen and the kids. Or how about, Lori, I know you're just getting over cancer. Is this a good time for me to move across the country to live in your town? My friends told me about this gorgeous mobile home park right at the beach in Santa Cruz. De Anza, have you heard of it? Yes, Mom. I'll go right from one ocean to the other. So you'll stop by and talk to the manager? Sure. Happy to do that for you. I grabbed a brand new yellow legal pad. It had been months since I'd made a list. What would I have put on it? Take toxic drugs, throw up, smoke pot so you could eat, grow white blood cells, watch West Wing reruns, survive? As I wrote, find Mom a place to live, De Anza, on the pristine yellow page, Mom said, gotta run, darling. I promised your Aunt Ruth a call tonight. Click. She hung up on me. The timer was still beeping. I looked into the pot. The spaghetti had congealed into a gelatinous mush. I dumped it in the compost and set a fresh pot of water to boil. As I lifted the heavy pot, I knocked my favorite glass off the counter, and it shattered on the floor. The kids were going to walk in at any moment, and they'd be starving. I swept up the shards and set the table for 4, but I couldn't remember which side the fork was supposed to go on.
Wow. Oof. I have chills over here. It's so powerful. Oh my gosh, Laura. Wow.
So that was the start. That was the start of this. That's like what in the writing they call that, or in the movies, that's the inciting incident. You know, that's what kicks the whole story into motion is she comes to California and then I have to deal with it for the rest of her life.
Wow. Wow. Yes. I mean, I'm almost speechless. The whole time that you're reading, I could just see it. And of course, you have such perfect inflection of what your mother's voice must truly sound like, which is so great. I mean, have you thought about making this book a movie eventually?
Oh, that's not really up to me. It's up to some movie producer. But I did record the audiobook, which I thoroughly enjoyed, last spring. So I really had, I've done a little bit of acting in my life, and I was a radio talk show host in my 20s. So I love audio. So it was super fun for me. But yes, I would love this to be a movie because the whole book is very visual. A lot of people have said that to me, but I don't have the funding to make a movie. So someone has to read it and think it's a good idea.
That's right. Well, we're gonna put that good juju out there because I think that this is just phenomenal. And just the journey of your relationship with her, because I do think what you're saying is the truth. When we have all these miles in between us, that's such a wonderful buffer.
Right.
It makes it so much easier to have relationship. And then your mother was there.
Yeah. Yeah. And declining. And, for those people who are watching or listening today, who've dealt with a family member with dementia, that just what a tough road it is. And especially in the early stages, she was volatile. She was incredibly anxious. I would get like 12 phone calls a day from her. She would be enraged and just explosive, unpredictable, just so difficult. And those very qualities that the dementia brought out were the same qualities that were kind of latent in her personality that I had to deal with growing up. So the whole thing was a tremendous trigger for me, and so there was a gap between the Laura who was, a mature adult who really just wanted to do the right thing by my mother. And, I showed up and I went to the doctor's appointments. I made the appointments. I did the research. I helped her find a place to live. I did all those things. But on the inside, I was in so much turmoil. And so it was how was I going to make peace on the inside with the actions I was doing on the outside? And I ultimately I just wanted to know if I could open my heart to my mother, who I had every reason to shut down to. And when she arrived, I still was shut down, even though I was going through the motions of doing the right things. I knew on the inside, I still had just such a wall. So that's the journey that's the trajectory of this character is, can she open her heart when she's learned for many reasons that it's not safe to do so?
Yes. Yeah. So we're going to talk about this more after a short break. We're going to have a short station break, and then we're going to come back and be talking to Laura Davis more about her amazing book, The Burning Light of Two Stars. So come and join us here on The Spark. Welcome back to The Spark. I'm Stephanie James, and I'm here talking to Laura Davis, best-selling author and teacher, speaker. And we're talking about her amazing book, The Burning Light of Two Stars, a mother-daughter story. And it's a story of Laura. It's a memoir of Laura and her mother and the struggles that they went through. One of the things that you were talking about right before we went to break is this concept of how do you really open your heart to someone who's betrayed you? And what that reminded me of is a time when I had interviewed Harriet Lerner, who did the Dances of Anger and the Dances of Intimacy. And I was interviewing her on her book, Why Can't You Say I'm Sorry? And the part that stuck out to me was the chapter on forgiveness. And one of the things that really struck me was this concept of that we don't always have to do full pardon forgiveness. That we can do, a 95% forgiveness. And it doesn't mean you're holding on to the venom or the negative energy of that last 5%. But her image that she gave, or what the story that she shared, is a couple that was in therapy and he had cheated on her. And so they had worked through issues in therapy. And 2 years later, when they came back to therapy, it was about children. It had nothing to do with their actual marriage. But when they sat down in those chairs, the husband turned to her and said, I'm wondering, now that we're here, did you totally forgive me for having the affair? And she said, I forgave you 95%. But the 5% that I will never be able to forgive is that you had sex with this woman in our bed while I was in a different city taking care of my dying father. that 5% is not forgivable. And Harriet said she'd really struggled with that chapter because people were like, you have to do this full pardon forgiveness. And I found, thinking of my own experience, my own journey, being able to say that and, to say, yes, I forgive you, but there are some things that are really unforgivable. Again, we can completely heal and we don't have to hold on to that angst or that energy. I'm really curious how that lands with you and what your thoughts are around that.
The whole concept of forgiveness for me is complex. My experience of it, I did forgive my mother and I did forgive my grandfather, who was my perpetrator. But in both cases, it was not a goal of mine. It was not something I sought after. It felt more like a byproduct of my natural healing process. And for me, it came kind of way, way, way at the end. And I think the biggest problem about forgiveness is how much it's foisted on people and how much people are told you have to forgive. And I think there actually are a lot of ways to let go of the kind of rage that can, there's a Yiddish expression that says, when you're out for revenge, you better dig 2 graves, and I think there's truth to that. But I think there's a lot of ways to move past that kind of bitterness, and that forgiveness is one, and it's not the only one. So, I may be an outlier on this, but I think the first forgiveness we need is for ourselves, for anything we may have done that we're holding ourselves accountable or responsible for. And then the healing process requires rage, it requires grief, it requires speaking about what happened to us and claiming it, and a lot of other stages. And for me, forgiveness is way at the end. And I don't consider it the be all and end all, of healing. With my mother, I think the way I would describe it more is that I was able to see her from a much vaster perspective, like instead of just seeing her as the mother that I was at odds with or the mother that betrayed me, I got to the point where I was able to see her in the vaster perspective of her life, like that this man who was my grandfather was her father, and she lived with him her whole childhood. And that she had grown up in this poor immigrant family where she felt all the shame about the poverty that she grew up in, that she grew up in an era where there were so many more limited choices for women. And I began to see her, I began to admire a lot of things about her. Like, she was a remarkable woman for her generation. And that didn't take away the fact that she had betrayed me, and that she had been really difficult for me on a lot of levels. But I was able to see her from a different point of view. And that enabled me to create her as a character on the page who is not just a villain, who is a complex, multifaceted person. And I liked when I got to the end of finishing 10 years of writing this book that people would say things like, on this page, I loved your mother and I hated you. And on this page, I hated you. I hated your mother and loved you. And that I had been able to do that. And that came in part from forgiving her, but even more from being able to see the complexity of her life and all the things that shaped her. I think my mom gave me that it was because of her in many ways that I had the courage to face the incest with my grandfather, and that I had the strength to heal, and I had the strength to break away from my family and establish my own autonomous life. And in some ways, she gave that to me, but didn't have it herself. So it's kind of ironic to me that she gave me the gift of something that she couldn't quite manifest on her own.
Yeah. And how powerful that is that she actually, instilled that within you. And then that was what ended up being that essential piece that helped you to heal from your own experience from her father.
Yes. Yeah. And there were so many more resources I had than she ever had, both as a survivor and then as a parent. There, and I think also, I'm a parent of 3, I'm the grandparent of 3, and, going through that much life and that much life experience, just made it easier to see my mother and her mistakes, not as set in stone in the way that I held them for so many years.
Yeah. And what you're saying really touches my heart, because that's as a psychotherapist, that's my experience too, when I'm working with people and we are able to kind of get behind our parents' eyes, or anyone's eyes, for that matter, to try
Yeah.
to understand exactly what you said, the complexities of what makes someone up, that their behavior is just not unidimensional, that there's other things that may help explain it. Again, it's not to just say, oh, it was okay. It's not to make it okay, but it's to understand. I think that can help us heal when we go back and understand what made them, or what were the components that caused them to have the personality traits or behaviors that they had.
I think that we can't really move towards reconciliation or forgiveness until we have healed from the trauma that caused it to begin with. It's like, until we know that we can supersede what happened to us and that we don't have to be bound to it, I think that's what gives us the freedom and the latitude to have more graciousness, more compassion, and more generosity. As long as we're still kind of under the thumb of what happened to us and it's still really limiting our lives, there's no way to have that kind of perspective. So I think the healing really has to come first, and then renewing or healing or resolving of the relationship is a later step.
No, I absolutely agree. Yes. I think you're exactly right. That once we've healed so much of that wound within us, then we do have the capacity to have that insight, or to, potentially have empathy and compassion. Yeah. So I'm curious, what was your healing process like as you were writing this book?
Writing the book was, I started, it took me 10 years, and I was writing. I've written about my mother. I think the first thing I published about her, I was 23 years old. So over 40 years ago, I was writing and publishing about my mother. So she's definitely been one of my major life obsessions, like this. It's such a primal relationship for me that I've been wrestling with it for, my whole life, basically. So I had always written about her, and I had little pieces and little things I'd written. And then when she moved out to California and I started caring for her, I would do things like, I would take her to like 3 or 4 doctor's appointments every week. Anyone who's dealt with an elderly parent or an ill spouse or has had to deal with this. So I would take her to all these appointments, and she couldn't remember anything. So I would be writing down what the doctor said and medication changes, whatever it was. But I would also be like taking notes on the color of the wall and, what poster was there. And I would write down little bits of dialogue, because even with her dementia, sometimes she was just hysterically funny. I mean, the things she would say, I remember this one time I told her that I'd had breast cancer and she didn't remember it, and she said, "You let them cut your boobs off?" I mean, I had to laugh at her because, it was sad, but it was funny. And so I would write down these things. And in part, it was because I knew I wanted to write about her. And I think as writers, we are guilty of cannibalizing our lives for material, even if we're writing fiction. But also, I think the writing for me, it created a little bit of distance from how difficult the situation was. So I think I used it as a coping mechanism. So I would take those notes, and then in the evenings I would go home and I kept a log, just like a really rough log of what happened every day in terms of my relating to her, or what had happened in her life. So by the time I came to write this book, I actually had a written record that had a lot of dates and times and quotes and chronology. So that was really helpful. And then as I wrote the book, particularly the scenes from the past that were so painful that I had to write to establish why we were estranged in the first place. At first I would be just sobbing as I wrote the first drafts of these scenes. But when you write a book like this, I rewrote every page in that book at least 100 times. And that is no exaggeration. And so as you begin to develop the raw material into a story, it's not like it's not a movie like of everything exactly as it happens. You craft it into a story that will be compelling for the reader. And that means you emphasize certain things, you de-emphasize certain things, you choose which events you're going to portray and which ones you're going to drop out, and what are the dramatic turning points. You always want to include those. A lot of the more boring, mundane things you don't include. I mean, no one really needs to know all of that. So for me, it was a way of coming to terms with what had happened. And one of the most kind of fascinating and challenging things was that after my mother died, in her things, I was cleaning out her things, and I found this thick manila envelope, and it had all the letters I had ever sent to her. And then it had all the letters, copies of all the letters she had ever sent to me. And then it had first drafts of letters she had composed but never sent. So the censored letters. And in my journals from that time, which I had buried in a box, I had done the same. I had saved the same. And it ends up, we had an amazing correspondence. And this was, way before the time of the internet or email. So, letters we've really lost so much in losing the art of correspondence, but we wrote to each other. And when I put together my letters and her letters, it was like 2 file folders, like a foot thick. And it was very painful to read those, because what I had to realize is that the actual evidence, this physical written letters, that they were moldy and they were like, the pages were breaking in my fingers, that those letters contradicted many of the habitual stories I had told about my mother for decades. And that it made me understand that I had her mistakes and her failures, I had really embedded in stone, and her good qualities and the loving qualities, I had just let them like fritter away like water. And so I had always said, like, we didn't speak for 7 years. And then when I looked at the letters, we had been writing to each other the whole time. So there was always this thread between us. So I had to confront a lot in the writing process and really look at the nature of memory and what is truth, and how I had created a character, my mother, into a character where she was definitely my antagonist, and she was the villain, and I was the hero or the victim. And as I wrote the book, I knew I didn't want to portray either one of us that way. And so I had to go deeper. I had to find what's the real story under the story, where she's not the villain. She's a human who made some terrible decisions, some terrible mistakes, and she also tried. And so, that was the journey I was on. And for me, writing was the tool to discover it. And I, in the course of writing, it's interesting, I had to get back into therapy myself because the material was so difficult and the things I was facing was so challenging. And while she was still alive, I had trouble differentiating the mother of the past with the mother I was dealing with today. And I needed to get some help doing that.
Well, and thank goodness. I mean, I just am like so blown away by the power to heal, and that the writing process, I mean, it just feels like it was that. It continued to be cathartic for you. It continued to be this big healing process. And when you look at your life now, after having written this book, what do you notice?
There was I have an epigraph in the front of the book by this writer named Deborah Fruchet, and it says, "Every time I look in the rearview mirror, the past has changed." And, that's how I think about it. I think if I was to start this book now and write it now, I would probably tell a different story than the one I told. If I had attempted it, 20 or 30 years ago, well, I wouldn't have succeeded, but I certainly wouldn't have had the depth and the complexity that it has now. I mean, I've been hearing from people who've read it, and they said they finished reading it and they started reading it all over again because there was so much there, and it brought so much up for them about their mothers, their daughters, their family, their parenting, that they just wanted to dig in again, So I think it takes. I was teaching a writing workshop today, and someone asked, can you write about trauma when it's happening? And I think you can, and I think it's a good idea to do it. In most cases, it can be healing and you could record the heat of the moment, but you're not going to have the perspective for something that you would then want to publish and share with the world, because it takes years to get the kind of perspective so that it's not just what happened, but what you've learned from what happened. And that really is what a memoir should be. It should be not just a series of events, but really it's the deep learning of the main character, how they were transformed over time, and how they have come to understand the meaning of what they went through, not just the events.
Yeah. Yes. And I'm hearing, I mean, that's one of the powers of this book. And as your other books, it's the power of transformation. You share how you transformed. And then as we're reading this book, and I remember it's been a little while since I've read this now, but just that feeling of connectedness that we actually are also transforming as we're reading it, as we're connecting to the story, as we're connecting to the characters. And as you said, other people are commenting how they see themselves through it.
Yeah, I mean, I had a woman write me the other day. She said, Laura, I just want you to know, I just picked up the phone and I called my mother for the first time in 18 years. I mean, you can't get more, as an author, you can't be more gratified than having someone say something like that to you. You know, that the words you put on a page, you know, influenced her to that degree, was just really moving. And I think there's one thing I do want to say that I think is really important, is that the path I took with my mother is not for everyone. My mother had a lot of redeeming qualities, but I think there are definitely circumstances where, you know, you're estranged from a parent or a child or whoever in your life, and it's actually the best choice. You know, there are some people where it's just too toxic and too dangerous. And I don't think anyone should give up their emotional well-being to maintain a relationship with anyone. And I don't think that because you were someone's child, you owe them caretaking. You know, if the relationship has been violated to that degree, it's sort of like the normal rules don't apply anymore. So I think each person is in a different situation. And it's really a personal journey of where you want to end up and where you want to land and what's possible. There's a lot of kind of give and take and experimenting to find out what's possible. You know, can you actually have a real reconciliation with a person where you see each other and you connect? Or is it much more like on a spiritual, emotional level where you need to keep your distance, but you're able to, as one woman said to me, she said, Laura, I had to close the door, but I left the porch light on. You know, that she couldn't have a relationship with her parents who had been violent, abusive alcoholics, you know, and remained that way. But she said she finally got to a point of really having empathy and compassion for them. And even though she didn't want to see them, she was able to wish them well from afar. That always really touched me.
Yeah. And I'm so appreciative of you sharing this with the audience, because I think it's such an essential piece and one that really resonates in my own life. And also, you know, I feel like that's something that I talk about a lot, is how we detach with love, not from, you know, a bitter, angry place, but from a place where we're healing and making these choices where we're not going to continue to be in a toxic relationship, and we can detach with love. It doesn't have to be this bloody ending. It doesn't have to be something that's dramatic. And so it can be, you know, about boundaries and having really the best life that we can possibly have when we're not in those toxic relationships. So I want to make sure that we have time to talk a little bit about your groups that you're doing, your writers' workshops, because this is also, I know, just a passion for you and helping people to find their own stories. Would you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I've been teaching writing really since The Courage to Heal came out. So that was 33 years ago. And for the last 20 plus years, I've been leading writing retreats, writing groups, writing circles, both in my home community of Santa Cruz and actually all over the world. I've taken people traveling, like I've taken people to Vietnam, to Bali, to Spain, to Peru. And it's like a combination of adventure, cultural exploration, and then like a little grounding, a couple hours a day of writing, which I think it's really nice to take a creative vacation like that. It bonds the group. And since the pandemic started, almost all my teaching has been online, which has been, I'd always sworn I wouldn't do that, because I didn't think I could create the container and the safety that's necessary for a writing group without being there in person. But I found that it's completely possible. And I've been delighted to have students from all over the world. So I think a lot of teachers have discovered it's really kind of amazing to be able to offer what you're offering and not be limited by geography. So I am a writing teacher. I love teaching people how to write, especially writing as a tool for transformation and healing and self-knowledge and self-growth. I also help people sometimes with the craft of writing, people who are working on a book. And the thing is, I love more than anything, I don't work individually with people. I really love what happens in groups. I love the dynamic when a room full of people, either virtual or physical, get together and start sharing their stories from the deepest place and listen to each other with respect, confidentiality, and awe. And there's just an incredible healing that happens, and people, one person's story cracks open the next person. And it's just, I think, an amazing environment. And I love facilitating that. I mean, it's really like my joy is to do that and to watch people just gradually open more and more and more and more. So that's what I love to do with my time, my work time. And just to see how stories heal us. And stories also, I think, especially right now, they build bridges between people. When you hear someone not voicing their opinion, their surface opinion, but you hear the deep story that led to them having that point of view, it just melts divisiveness. So I think that writing can actually be a very powerful tool right now for all of us. We're living in a culture, a society, a world where there's so much divisiveness. And I think that the arts and writing can be a real tool to bring people together, to understand across differences.
I absolutely agree. The thing that you were sharing about people resonating with your book, as I did as well, is we see that commonality in the story. It touches a point. There's a touch point within us, in our hearts. So how beautiful. It feels like your whole career has been around helping people to find their voice and to tell their story in different capacities.
Yeah, I think that's true. Even when I was a talk show host in Alaska in my 20s, and it was the same. I just loved drawing stories out of people. So it's definitely been there. On my website, there's like a little a tagline. It says, "Healing words that change lives." And that's what I've done. It's done it through my books, through my teaching, through this new book. And I just feel like that was my mission. I came in with that, and I luckily discovered it at a pretty young age and have been able to create that and really serve a lot of people in that way. I always feel honored, just really honored by people's stories. It's always a privilege to kind of peel back the surface and find out what's going on underneath. I mean, I'm sure you experience that as a therapist. This is a different form, but it's just, there's no honor like it.
Yeah.
Than to be a witness to someone's growth, someone's change, and someone discovering the truth about their lives.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, I feel like you and I are speaking the same words. I can hear those same words inside of my head, because it's such a privilege to get to be a part of the healing journey and to witness people's healing journey. I mean, that's one of the greatest gifts in my life as well. And Laura, before we get wrapped up here, first of all, how can people find out about your workshops? Where's the book? Where can people get the book? And maybe also if they just want to connect with you.
Okay, so my website is the best place. It's lauradavis.net. lauradavis.net. You could go there and read about my retreats, my workshops, my classes. I have posted the first 5 chapters of this memoir, The Burning Light of Two Stars, on my site. It's more of a sample than you'll read on Amazon, for instance, because I really want people to get a taste of what this story is. And you could find that at www.lauradavis.net/chapters. That's lauradavis.net/chapters. And there's also, you'll find there, links to buy the ebook, the paperback, the audiobook. And on social media, on Facebook, I'm at The Writer's Journey. And on Instagram, I'm at Laura Sari, Sari Davis, Laura Sari Davis. And on my website, you could join my mailing list. I'll send you a free ebook, which is called Writing Through Courage, a 30-day practice. And it's 30 days of prompts to help build courage. And I also send out writing prompts every week that I think also are thought-provoking, evocative, good for either writing or conversation. All of that at www.lauradavis.net.
Wonderful. Well, as we get ready to wrap up, Laura, what is the essential message that you'd like to leave with the audience?
If you had asked me, if you had asked me who I was at age 27 or 28, I would have said I'm an incest survivor, and that would have been my whole identity. And now, if you were going to ask me who I was, I would say I'm an author, I'm a writing teacher, I'm a workshop leader, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a swimmer, I'm a mahjong player, I'm a hiker, and I wouldn't even put incest survivor on the list. And so I think what I want to say is that we can change in ways that we can't anticipate if we live long enough. If you had asked me back then if I would ever end up being at my mother's deathbed and wanting to be there, I would have looked at you like you were so insane. And yet that's how things ended up between us. So I think that's what I want to say to people, is that no matter how stuck you feel right now or how things feel rigid and locked in place, that change is actually possible. And sometimes it will happen in ways that we just can't imagine or anticipate.
Beautiful. Laura, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your incredible message, for sharing this new amazing book with the world, The Burning Light of Two Stars, a mother-daughter story. It's absolutely incredible. Please pick it up. And Laura, thank you so much for spending this time with me. Love having you here on The Spark.
Oh, Stephanie, it's been a pleasure. Always love to talk to you.
Thanks for tuning in to The Spark with Stephanie James. Remember that you already have what you need to live a life that is fully lit and fully alive. You're already holding the flame. Now it's time to ignite your best life. Learn more at stephaniejames.world. That's stephaniejames.world. And tune in next week at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, only on transformationtalkradio.com. Shine on!